moderating this roundtable. I'm very excited for what will emerge. We're going to dive right in, and I'm going to keep us on schedule. So over to you, Suzy.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Leela and Yale, Sakiri, and goodbye. It actually triggered so many memories that I'm going to quickly read my paper just after not thinking about with my Lahmete Foundation years of making work 50 years ago, the things trying to actually distill it into 5 to 7 minutes was virtually impossible. So I mean, there even when talking, Tom and I kind of were uncertain about certain dates or soft things, and I think it's good that Nell's on the panel as well, because she was around in this Arabia 2 weeks. So Tom was a valuable founding member of AHU. He was exclusively responsible for incorporating the AHU Press into our experiment. Tom's work was also a beacon for asking questions and taking risks. The artist-run gallery system it has evolved to accommodate emerging artists in developing aesthetics. We call ourselves actually alternative gallery, not run space, nor like but none of the stuff was there to begin when we started our career. So my position at the Roundtable is to talk about all those unknown risks and how we invented our way through them, or who we asked to help. So there are no risks, consequences, and tasks that Tom and his merry dozen had to hurdle in order to build something from nothing. All my slides are pretty random. I lost most of my documentation, by the way, to the virtual archive at Concordia. So what I had left primarily photographs of us in terms of our board meetings. When I arrived in Montreal, I didn't know it at the time, but several things were coming to play that felt concurrent enough to make something new. Montreal was energized by Expo 67, the Quiet Revolution, Habitat, the Pride of FLQ, and concluded promises of investment in social change. The Musée d'Art Contemporain was built for Expo. There was a remarkable crossover of communication by the different disciplines of dance, music, writing, theater, on the streets and the galleries and everywhere in Montreal at that time. But there was no common ground for a space to really experiment. 2, despite Montreal's cosmopolitan investments during Expo, Quebec had no funding program for individual visual artists. The Art Bank and the Canada Council were really relatively new, and they weren't prepared for collectives yet. There were only a few commercial galleries, but formalism was the dominant aesthetic. I appreciated formalism, but I was not the only one who was concerned about the schism between what was happening in the studio and what was happening on the street. Yet formalism's reduction to concept made ontological sense to many of us as a visual continuum, as seen in the documentation of Harold Zeman's exhibition, Live in Your Head, When Attitude Comes Forth. That was really a critical introduction to alternative thinking that seemed to be responding to the energy of the time. So how did 13 artists that came from very different communities seem to come together and to form an artist-like center? Although a desire for alternatives and experimentation began in small pockets around Montreal, art historian and critic Normand Thériault initiated my introduction through an organized protest called the Concours de Québec. And by the way, This protest resulted in 30 artists submitting 30 bales of hay. But along with Armand, there was artist educator Gary Cowler, who happens to be Tom's mentor, and a great mentor to us that continued on in lead. It really supported his graduating students in, that were doing alternative, and he nurtured alternative practice. I was pursuing a federal local initiatives grant with my teaching colleagues at the museum school. Artists Millie Riska and Henry Sachs brought us all together in their studio to discuss working together over a period of at least a year to create a community space with the idea of community for a cross-discipline experimentation. Of this group, 13 artists continued discussion on the need for an alternative space to test art's edges. Making our wish list for exploration was easy. Space and facilities for these alternatives became logical because of that. There was a sense of doing this for the community beyond our own art needs. This meant we were not opening a gallery that would attempt sales, thus no income. Many of us were green as grass because there was nothing formed that we could apply for. At the time, Quebec provided little to no funding for artists. The Canada Council was relatively new, as I said, but their intention appeared to support artists that promised success. There wasn't a program for collective support. However, their interest in what we were doing was genuine. They proposed that if our collective became a legal entity, something may be able to be put in place in the future. Millie Restvet found a lawyer that counseled us for free in order to incorporate. Most of us either didn't have the money for a lawyer or didn't have a clue on even how to get one. We needed a name, and according to the lawyer, we needed a name and elect a board of directors. We needed to have a bank account, yet bank loans were out of the question to such low wage earners. And that was back in the day before women were even allowed to have their own credit cards, right? In the interim of the Canada Council funding for a collective, Suzanne Rivard-Louen encouraged each of us to apply for a personal short-term grant that would actually subsidize our volunteer work to form a gallery as well as develop our own work. It was under the guise that we were actually applying for a grant for our projects. And this quasi-agreement was not to become public, and now it has. As these conditions weren't proper to the adjudication of the process back then. But I did mention that the National Gallery and the Canada Council had people like Suzanne Rivard-Louen and Pierre Tiderge, who really very active and aware of contemporary practice in Canada. So again, the thing is like nothing goes in place, but the thing is it's like there was a response to what we were doing. During this strange funding period, we continued to determine the space and how it was to be used. As opposed to Montreal's small commercial salon-sized galleries, we needed a space large enough for lectures, performance, and film production by all disciplines. We were fortunate to have collaborating poets, dancers, and musicians that eventually curated their own disciplines within our program in larger space. The need for video was not imminent, but a separate room was needed for Tom's donation of a working press for artist access. Giveaways became an aesthetic strategy for community interaction. Tom's printed handouts, as you can see in the show, were done. And Alan Bealey began Betsy magazine. The poetry community had access to self-publishing. The press was able to support pressmen, but not a gallery. We wanted our office to be able to enable a library with our collections of conceptual literature, all of our documentation of exhibitions, and so on and so forth. Our slide collection was to be available for educational purposes or curatorial research. We oftentimes were invited to actually bring this research to, University of Montreal or Concordia was, I don't know if it was Sir George Orrick still, but, and so many members actually did that volunteer work. In 1971, we were legally incorporated. Véhicule became Véhicule Art Inc., and other artist-run spaces were forming. Véhicule actually shared its documentation, a template to incorporate a collective for funding. So now a lot of this is logical, but the thing is, it's like it was actually put together so that nobody had to really learn the hard way. In 1972, Véhicule it did get its first grant of $4,000 to rent a space. It was big enough for Henry Sachs to ride his bicycle, but he had to ride it in circles. We opened in October of 1972, and thanks to Vincent, we've actually seen a lot of images of the space. For those of you that saw Tom's video in the exhibition, we did really find the perfect space. All these activities meant each of us were assigned to be responsible for an area to oversee. But in reality, that was like herding cats. Furthermore, each member was responsible to program an exhibition for 1 month. Given our framework of interests, exhibiting artists were never edited. It was about experimentation. This meant that sometimes we had an exhibition of vitaminized canvases or grids of feces across the gallery floor. So it's no wonder that the first external collection of the Véhicule, collection of Véhicule founders that was exhibited and was reviewed in Arts Canada had the headlines, "The barbarians are coming, the barbarians are coming." That's really true.
I have made my talk too.
Okay, so Montreal was small, and submissions reflected this. So mail art was actually mentioned, and then Véhicule was doing a lot of curate for mail art. And I mean, my memory is that Roger Fillon from France, at Dijon, was quite seminal in orchestrating a lot of the correspondence that came to North America. So we started, having international art guests exhibiting at our place. But the other thing too is I mentioned key figures in the community. Pierre Tiberge informally was an excellent source to informally connect us to what was happening across Canada and all the birth that you may not be seeing in publications. Because this was newer, we weren't really seeing it in press yet. But at the same time as Pierre may be actually introducing intermediate to Véhicule, or we learned about A Space Gallery through here. And then as, of course, we traveled, we had places to drop in and cement those relationships. Véhicule often had open calls for themed shows. I think I've got a poster for Brother Andre's heart. Brother Andre was, his heart was stolen from St. Joseph's Oratory. It was a traumatic period for Montreal. So we actually put together an open call, and we had an incredible range of response, empathetic and other. as a show. The interest was crossover media to see what the hybrid would be. There was a show called Sound is Visual, Visual as Sound. There were magazines that published what we wanted to see, but we had no internet access. So we depended on grapevine and literary. Actually, it was kind of more like writing like fan letters to artists that you really liked. There were, even though it was maybe public in New York, we're so flattered that somebody outside of New York was interested. You know, we often were able to exhibit their work. So in fact, even as a individual group, well-known New York conceptual artists wanted to test out their new work as their careers were cemented before showing it in their new directions in New York. So they chose to show how they feel, to see if they really, if it was a good piece or if they had any dirty laundry. In these days, early days, there was no funding for our visiting artists to travel, but the thing is, a lot of this communication was the excitement of a common interest in crossing disciplines and experiment. So they were billeted in family members' homes. For me, the informality of having to prepare someone's show and then billet them in my home and then take them around the city, you know, if they were artists from outside town, was actually the main thing that multiplied my education in terms of art practice, you know, 1,000-fold. And I swear that, artists run spaces as they increased and artists were traveling more between cities because of the artist run gallery system, that the need for residencies, somebody kind of saw that, and the need for residencies may and could have been formed to actually reinforce a more stable communication and exchange. But regardless, ridicule to me was my true MFA. So much volunteer work for the founders logically became too obligatory for many of the original founders, and each year younger artists would take their place. By 1974-75, conceptual art was visible beyond the artist-run gallery system. And this sensibility was visible in provincial galleries and museums as well. New commercial galleries did exhibit some of the object-based experimental work. And gradually, the interest of an alternative space as experiment shifted to become a parallel space within the art system.
We're going to take that money away from you, Suzy. Okay, Montreal. Yeah, so probably many of you can identify Saint Laurent Boulevard, the name here on the very left. Yeah. Let's keep the pointer out. Here it is. So yeah, I thought I would. I'm scheduled to do the geography, so we'll start with where things were. Our house was, let's see, I have to, where is our house was, hey, here's the Burrow building. I think it's a kind of, there's a slide before this. No, there's a slide up before there. Yeah. See, this is different because there's four. Yeah, no, it's not cut off. It's that side follows. No, Here's a state out, please. Please.
No, that's do. It's okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, I just trying to locate myself like the other side and keep going. Okay, so Parvex was around here, just off the main, and there's a blank space here now. These are the big buildings that were in the textile industry, sort of handshake hold, trying to hold mic and elbows on the table. This is the Bourbon Building, or 4060 Saint Laurent, the Cooper, the Balfour, the Grotte. These are all the textile industry of mostly, I think entirely, Jewish merchants, starting from back in the 19th century. And by the time Powerhouse arrived here, that population had moved up northward, and this was a largely Portuguese, Greek immigrant population around us. So Tom's studio would have been here in this stretch, and then Vehicle, I think it's where his hole is here now. And the big reason that I wanted to put in the whole view is that the back, the Musée d'Art Contemporain, is way out here on Cité du Havre, which was the expo site, as was mentioned. But it wasn't an expo, it was in a pavilion that had been built for expo, but moved there in '68. So it wasn't actually there for expo. So you could see really how the map out here kind of needed, to access something a little bit more uptown. Okay, so now you could go to the next slide, which is really just a map that shows that the same thing, the trajectory, how you got down here, which was either like a difficult bike ride or a drive on the expressway. Very unfortunate location. And then the next one is that, it's a cropped shot, which I don't really know why it's here, but you can move on to the next. This was the musée. I mean, that building is still there. I think the Saint-Georges is trying to take it over, I read, but it's a great building. And I'm not going there. I had a kind of, I guess, rosy, happy discourse about this starting today, and then talk with Vincent a fair bit. And I thought that, for Fernand Saint-Martin, who was the director of the MAC at that point, was an advocate for a new experimental art. He kind of disabuses me a bit and says, no, she was a bit more conservative than that, intended towards the didactic, how to bring art out to the general population. But they did have a curator there who was from France, Madame Cablan. He probably was more connected with the post-conceptual scene in New York, more interested in that, and was the guy who did ultimately bring the Véhicule Créés, into the MAC in '74. But the other thing is that I think there was also contention among artists. For example, the Montreal grew from Wickham, because everybody wanted him. Even though this museum was located way out there, nonetheless that they were a museum. Oops, now that is cut off. That's a bummer. Can you go out of full screen for that? Because there's a caption. Okay, so this address was 67 St. Catherine West, the Ligne de Vallée Tranquille, which did not mean a quiet space to read. That was actually the guy's name, the owner. So I assume that this, perhaps you guys recognize it, Suzy and Tom. I assume this was the Véhicule building here. Look familiar? Not sure. Because if this is, did I say 67? Yeah. Can you go out of full screen, because I want to see the caption. Can you just pop back to the not full screen? Like a skater or something?
It is for full screen. So cut.
That's weird. Okay, so this is, I could say, French. This is 68. This one digging on the internet, which is so fun. This is 68, so not that long before 72. And it says, many establishments on Rue Saint-Catherine near Saint-Laurent are known as the preferred rendezvous for homosexuals, prostitutes, and pederasts. So, stop me. So this is the whole concept of like the lower main, which I'm assuming, although I was a bit young for this crowd, and I'm still in school when the founding was half beat, but I'm assuming that this was a big part of the attraction. And around the corner on Saint Laurent, down here, are still the remnants of the old, red light district. Can you foresee that? And there you are. It was actually a lot of scriptures. Oh yeah. Yeah, when you were still. Oh yeah. So anyway, this I pulled up just to show the inside, but we've seen them already. So the next slide, and this shows them as an English scene, images of that. So this building, this is where it was. So now this is looking east, and there's still what you might call a remnant. But that red light district was huge. It was infamous, and there were several reasons for that. One was that alcohol was legal in Quebec in the 40s, or whenever prohibition was, 30s, 40s in the U.S. and elsewhere in Canada. So there were brothels, there was gambling and mafia, but there was also jazz clubs, like famous jazz clubs, and it was the gay district. It was one of the gay districts. That was a big one. So here's another 68 shot from the Lower Main, like below St. Catherine. So Vacule and then around the corner going south. The Nelly Billiard. And I read that this guy here was some jazz firm known in the area. And then the other interesting thing is that many things I was reading about this red light district said you're ordinary in the day, lady with stroller, guys talking, and then like talking at night. And here's the Cafe Press. So this is still there. So yeah, I mean, there's this tiny bit left. We used to go in there. It's the great drag bar where we used to go to in the 80s, and the late 70s and the 80s. And I think that Steve Lack's, looking at Tom DeCue first, but I think Steve Lack was like just down that here or just down a little further south.
It's so further north from Saint Laurent.
Further north from here?
It's lots of free from you.
I think they're thinking about walkers, but
Somebody lived down there because in the open house on the main, I thought it went all the way down to this lower part. I guess I'm wrong. There. Thank you.
That's north to the left? Is that right?
North to the right.
To the right.
Yeah. Anyway, doesn't matter. So in 74, there was a show called Pluriférie. I think it's been referred to. Yes, organized by Suzy Lake, and that was the Bavarians. That was what Gilles Dupin said in Frappe in la Presse about this show. And the next slide shows the artists. What did you propose? There's more than 13 people here, but still, the original 13 are in here somewhere. And I think one of the things I really wanted to point to here is that there are, it's not an absolute Franco-Lingual balance, that I think the Risée was making a point. They had to put that context of having Québécois artists, included, because our institutions, Vacule and Powerhouse, were identified as Anglo in these years. So it's a politic that really existed, and the other thing to note is that there are very few women. Okay, these are just a few examples of works. Delaval, he did a walk. Go ahead, and had photographs of his walk. The next one is Tom again from a performance at the opening, and then there's Suzy's piece next. Okay, what's this now? This Tanya? Go ahead. Next slide. Yeah. So in the open house on the Maid, it was the moment when Tanya Mars was showing her codpieces, and this Tanya is the one who brought Powerhouse from its Westmount founding over to the Main, or just east of the Main, and really put it on the map, put us on the map with this show. And of course, that open house was also where Taunt's Goodbye banner was displayed inside the studio. And it went all the way up to Rochelle, and there was a printing outfit called Braff that was very established. So it was a really big thing. And equally funky, or even more, was the Powerhouse building on St. Dominic Street. It's like, there's me. You. Yeah. Same kind of feeling of, yeah, we're a group of people and we do this together, volunteer. Go ahead. And this is the, sorry?
Is that why the three pictures of yourself, Laca Blanco, like in
It's a bit strange. Yeah.
it's not.
This was the big space. This was a show called Gastronomical Paintings by Dave Enderhout. It's just one of the pictures of the space that I could see. But it is a kind of, definitely a woman's kind of art, because look at the lavish display of food. Next. And then it's 75, so we can see that the Musée, one of the sponsors of this show, you know, because I think that for Nancy Martin, if not a kind of activist in a sense of openness to new experimental media, was definitely a feminist. And so this show, 450 women from everywhere submitted their work. It was this big, lavish thing. And I mean, I wish you could read this. I guess I can do a quick translation. Whoever said it. You know, the history of art up till now, geared to cultural and social evolution in Western civilization, has not yet taken into account, to this day, the female participation in the definition of a pictorial language. Talk about a mouthful, but like well said already. But the same curator at the Musée, Alain Fabin, is listed here. So they were embracing, you know, you did it in these different forms. And then there's just a few examples of some work. Oh, and the list of artists, the 93 artists. So another cool thing is that a couple of people like Françoise Sullivan, where is she? Who is very well known, right there, and Sorrel, I'd say was pretty well known by then, you know, came in on this rather marginal or perceived as marginal, you know, not feminist art, but feminist discourses around art. And that was good. And this is just a funny picture because that was our house. Strange people from all walks of life. And there's Tanya on a event that was like a parallel event to the art film. And this woman was in it. I don't think this is from the show, but that is actually some terminal artist, Patrick was a terminal artist then. But she likes the humanistic approach to sensuality and sexuality. I guess this is like you can stick over that. I don't really know why I put that there, but Isabelle Dallegal out of Paris. Now, this is just here to indicate that there was crossover, you know. I mean, Powerhouse embrace, the idea of Powerhouse was visibility. So it had to do the big embrace and really carried on with that, and probably to this day carries on with that. But there was still a lot of interest in the conceptual domain. Here's an example of one of our members in that show. She might need have been a vacant member at some point. And that's it.
That's great. Thank you, Nell. I took my prompt of 5 to 7 minutes fairly serious. Really, like, I'm a rule-bound person. And I'm going to speak more or less extemporaneously on a series of slides, and they're all centered on the exhibition and works in the exhibition. So I'm going to propose one trajectory through the show that was evident to me on seeing it with Lula and Tian. And then maybe some possible extensions into other practices over the course of the 70s. Because it occurred to me that we're looking at this extraordinary period in Tom's practice. It's kind of mind-boggling to think that this was 5 years, and the sophistication and degree of different strategies that are at play and different approaches to space, which is the kind of prompt for the panel, are pretty remarkable. So I wanted to kind of meditate on those works and just think through what possible way. What occurs to me, and these slides are these works are more or less going to be in chronological order, is that there is a kind of movement, and I won't make too much of this, but from the domestic spaces we're seeing here with 970 Market Street, and I'll talk about this in a moment, into the space of the studio, right? That's quite evident in terms of the mapping of the space of the studio, and then into the city with 100-foot lines. So there's this kind of interesting kind of movement out from and all this kind of archaeological painterly fascination with this house that Tom was living in Victoria while studying painting in 1969, outward into the city, and then of course these concerns with mapping and using maps as prompts for conceptual projects. Tom has got a little up and down. There are lots of other artists who engage with this, so much so that it's commented on as, as a phenomenon really as early as 1974. So I'll talk about that moment. But for those of you who don't know this work, 970 Margaret Street, which was made between 1969 and 1970. It began in the summer of 69. Tom was doing a painting course at the University of Victoria, and he stayed in this house. And over the course of 8 months, he realized, painstakingly I imagine, these 4 panels. Go to the next slide, yeah. You get a sense, here's an installation, you get a sense of the scale of these. I should have put in a detail because they're remarkably faithful transcriptions, I would almost say, of the linoleum floors in this house. So there's this very, taking the prompt and maybe still then thinking of your practice as a painting, as a painter, but rendering this kind of study of the house that you were living in it, and then translating it into these 4 panels. And this work was shown in an exhibition at the Museum des Arts de Montreal for realisms. Subsequently acquired by the museum, and my understanding is that it hasn't really been seen since it was acquired and exhibited. So remarkable work to bring these onto it back with you after so long. We can go to the next slide, only because Robert is here and I knew he was on the panel. I had to include this work, which is from the later part of the 1970s, 1979, called House Viruses, which immediately came to mind when I saw Tom's work, but also thinking through this kind of space that Robert was living in Toronto at the time. You were renovating the house, were you, Robert? Were you undertaking this renovation project? And so what we're seeing is a sculpture, these 3 polyhedrons is a more precise mathematical term for what they are. But they are samples of the wallpaper that he found in this house over the course of these renovations. 43 different wallpapers. That sounds like too much, but that's right. 43 different wallpapers. So it ends up becoming a kind of survey of almost like changing taste or ornament over a course of something like 70 years. But I think that so there's an impulse here that's similar across the 2 works. But I also love both artists' attention or attending to the spaces where they were living. And then the next slide, we're moving into these remarkable inflatable works, 4 Corners Inflatable, which was first conceived in 1971 and then remade for this exhibition this year. And then on the right, Chair from 1971. And these were kind of moving away now from that kind of painterly translation and into an actual attempt to render volumes rather than a kind of 3D into 2D or 2D into 2D translation. The space of the studio becomes rendered as these inflatables. And I think this is just remarkably, there another slide? Oh my gosh. So I think further on there's an installation view where I should get the sense of how Tom has reconstituted the space in the studio for use, or vantage points. So mediated through photography, but then rendered in 3 dimensions as space. And then with Chair, as those of you who've seen the show or seen the work realize, there's this great satisfaction that comes from finding the exact right angle with which this three-dimensional object resolves into a line drawing and becomes a kind of contour drawing. We're seeing it broken here, and you can imagine that if you align yourself perfectly, 3 dimensions resolve into 2. And so this is a pretty sophisticated kind of like Euclidean geometric exercise that Tom is engaging with, but also like the chair, what could be a more kind of mundane, domestic, everyday object than a fairly kind of ready-made and unremarkable chair. In the next slide, okay, so now we're expanding outside. We've left the house, we've left the studio, we're now moving into the space of the city. And this is kind of where I think Tom's practices begin to intersect and kind of bounce off of lots of other folks who are working in similar ways around maps. And Bill Dizan, of course, who, beginning in 69, 70, was engaging in these oral line projects and kind of mapping globally. He was working at the time, I think, for Esso, Imperial Oil, and had all of these like stashes and stashes of road maps. He had at his disposal, so like maps galore, and using them as supports for these conceptual projects. But by 1974, there was a special issue of Arts Canada called On Maps and Mapping, which surveyed a lot of these various practices that were interested in map making and using maps as support. And Joe Baudelaire wrote an essay in that special issue called Borderlines in Art and Experience, which provided a kind of brief survey. It begins with Stanley Brown, this way Brown from 1961, a kind of classic reference, and then also includes discussion, light discussion of Bill Dizan's work, a work called Transcandative by particular. But one wonderful line, which is the work that we're seeing by Tom, is in the exhibition. We're seeing on the left an installation of Duet, as I understand it, from a Bay Space exhibition in 1980 or thereabouts. And then on the right, great kind of moment of constructional, index card, general idea used index cards a lot. And it's great to see it's kind of combined extractive, instructional kind of prompt. It's a sandbag that looks more or less like fire hose that was, the project consisted of, maybe we'll go to the next slide here, Tom scattering randomly matchsticks over a map of his neighborhood in Montreal, and then where those matchsticks fell, he placed this corresponding 100-foot line with no real concern for whether it was on a rooftop or at a sidewalk or on a fire escape, kind of over this kind of real physical environment that had been kind of conceptual and dramatics before. And to go to the next slide, this is an installation from the General Idea Show in Ottawa. You're seeing a lot of early work from the 69 and 70. On the far right is a work called Line Project, which they realized around the same time in 1970 for an exhibition in Nightingale Gallery, which subsequently became A-Space. On the next slide. This is a view from it at the Suzy Lake, and then a detail of one of the photographs on the right-hand side. And that was a similar translation, but in their case, a kind of participatory project, which involved very complicated, like a radio advertisement, and they solicited participants, and then they visited their home, and they took photographs of the home, and then they mapped where they lived, and cut ropes, and then there was a rope holding event, and it was very much more kind of layered and kind of intermediate approach to this, but at the same time, a kind of use of the space of the city and maps to kind of develop a performance event. And I think that there's a real kinship there, I say, between Tom's work and this project by General Idea. Incidentally, this is the start of the main General Idea. When they show the work, the title of the work is General Idea, and they mistake it for the title of the artists. So it's a This Moment Flight project that the name is the one. And then, of course, we're moving beyond the space of the city, and Vincent showed us the inaugural issue of File Magazine. This is an image of a project in the second issue called the Borderline Research Project, where they solicit people to draw the border between Canada and the United States. And then in this second issue, they've compiled them all together as a kind of like super imposed multi-part imaginary geography. So the way in which maps and a work like 100-Foot Line kind of has extensions into other practices over the course of the 70s. The last slide. And I think I just wanted to say and to kind of end on my gratitude to both of you for organizing this show and Tom for this extraordinary practice, which this was the first chance that I've really been able to see and engage with these works. So it really was a revelation for me and has me thinking in all sorts of different directions and connections with these other artists. So thank you for reading the show. Thank you very much.
So for the majority of my talk, I'm going to have this image up on and we'll cycle through a few images guiding towards the end. The image up right now is of Tom Dean's works on paper that are currently at, we're just at the plumb. We're doing a rotating selection of Dean's works on paper. This was the first iteration of that. There's the second body work, which is featuring new works from the last couple of years, up currently for another 3 or 4 weeks. And then it will continue changing like that until the end of the year at the Blind. Running parallel with all the exhibitions that take place in the main galleries. This exhibition gone, I'm sort of delighted to see echoed in these newspaper updates on the walls. One thing I've been doing for the last 5 years is being one of about 20 people who run Plumb. It's an ad hoc collective of artists, writers, curators, who take turns organizing exhibitions, special events in this large, low space underneath the medical center at St. Clair and Dufferin. This particular show is curated by myself and Louis Carusi. So if you do have the chance, it is open along with, with our schedule with open hours every Saturday and Sunday. Tomorrow being the last day for the current exhibitions. So if you're so inclined, 2 to 5. And it's been wonderful listening to some of these stories about the cool and just feeling sort of parallels there. When I just wanted to observe with you guys briefly in my time talking the relationship of artistic work to spatial contingency and work's dependency on circumstance and one's ability to recognize spatial opportunities, which I feel like artist-run centers or alternative spaces, parallel galleries, or any of these things, these various survival strategies of young artists with no money trying to make something happen really close here. Digging into Tom's studio for this project and seeing the exhibition of Goodbye has been so inspiring for this, to see how Tom and these other artists at the time had generated work in relationship to their environment. The work is made in relationship to the possibilities provided by these spaces. The studio, the neighborhood, vehicular art. In the area that's now the heart of Montreal's entertainment district, artists long ago priced out this massive old loft in the former textiles district, and at the RDG, a show of massive, subtle, and unfabricated works mostly. I imagine that a pile of material might have been scavenged or along with a sewing machine or two at some point. My favorite moment in the opening reception at Goodbye was when you guys were asking questions and Tom described at one point falling asleep in the studio and waking up to a Montreal snowstorm with the city whited out and how a snowdrift had formed along into the gallery, through a door that he had left cracked open, and how he wanted to make something that was beautiful like that. And then my favorite piece in the show also was just described, the 100-foot line, this flicking of maps, flicking onto the map of the city, of the neighborhood, matchsticks to fern and the then marking, and then scaling that up with this canvas line and taking photographs of that. These have caused me to reflect on some of the special spaces that have been fundamental to certain art projects that I've been a part of. Just wanted to give a brief description of some of those collaborations that I've been involved with and how their physical space has impacted what was produced. When it comes to my art career, I've enjoyed it most when it's been collaborative, and I just wanted to sort of dwell, I guess, in those memories for a bit in relationship to just how striking the parallels and the have been with seeing Tom's work at the RNG. So in the early 2000s at the University of Guelph, colleagues of mine, Miles Stapp at James Gardner, and a bunch of other friends, started something called CS Galleries that we sort of formed around the idea of if we can see space, we should take it. This 2008 to 2010, we realized that we could script the fire code rules of the university by putting work on the walls in a forgotten corner of the art building's entrance hall. We organized alleyway art shows and a sculpture park in a stretch of quiet woods. And we had a studio in the basement of the then notorious family thrift store in Guelph. Rhea Mitchell, the owner, rented us the space for next to nothing, and he let us use his collection of things as materials for our projects. And we were in heaven down there. We had the boxes and spare furniture, chairs, doors, lamps, cabinets. We made art, but we also made a gallery, a screening area, a dance floor. We had a DJ booth, kitchen, 2-story fort that slept about a dozen people, and we hosted events down there. And the space fostered what we made and our ability to share with the community. And then I was able to find a few photos of some of it, the versus projects and goings on at the warehouse. So this can just cycle through manually. It's in no particular order, and some of the photos are not great quality. But so Wallace Chung, Ryan Clayton, Gemma Egan, James Gardner, Laura Kreviotsik, Steve McLeod, Laura Simon, Miles Stemp, and myself all lived down at 25 Polson on the pier near the club. And we adopted an experiment in being together too much and making things constant. We lived there 2010 to 2017. It was a artist collective and artist center, I guess, out of the warehouse. We hosted residency programs, we had our studios, and we did projects abroad. When Versus moved in, and this is at Art Metropole, when Versus moved in, the first rooms defined were the gallery, personal studios, and the wood shop. Not our bedrooms. We were Sigma floor. Space for making and sharing art was the priority. We never had permission to live there though, so we did have to sort of hide our bedrooms at some point, up ladders, trapdoors, and ceilings behind walls, and even a sliding bookshelf. We had no one toilet, a couple hot plates, but we had a lot of energy, a lot of fun making art, experimenting with how to live. This is some images from Mercy. We had, the space immediately had an impact on the work. The warehouse, the plywood, the ladders, the docks, the pier. Any spatial influence on all spatial influences on how we engage together. We made collaborative art together, and as the practice grew, we began to create bigger gallery installations. Yeah, constantly in parallel with our smaller productions and residencies and whatever events. With sculptural interests fostered from our habits in the warehouse, lofts, bunk beds, building materials, nooks and crannies, provisional fucked up DIY strategies, and different ways of living. Lists of some of the major exhibition names, the titles of which I think speak to some of this fascination with the space and accumulation and how to live together and how to experiment. Moves In at Art Metropole, Space Mods at Cambridge Art Galleries, Not Together but Alongside at Mercer Union, to Space In at it was at Katzman, and At the Same Time at Contemporary Counter. This space fostered what we made and our ability to share with our community. And then recently is the Plumb, and quite a longer list of artist names. How are we doing for time? Project dedicated to, many people know these people. See, they're all active in the city. Come to the Plumb, you'll meet them. It's been a project dedicated to offering a surplus of space in a city where space is at premium. This is a group of people who pitch together on the rent and figure out the rest. Most Plumb activities provide exhibition space to emerging artists. A lot of the ones that I've been working on, I've been looking back at various radical activities that I'm excited by and want to re-embrace so that communities of different generations can stay connected and remember these sites. A Good Time with Joan Goodwin, Never Enough Night with Andy Patterson, Luxurious Labor with Charlie Murray, and On with Tom Dean. These have been the projects that I've focused on myself. This space is underground, physically down the stairs, under a medical center, and the work that shows embraces the underground. The name, the Plumb, acknowledges this. The basement has a real effect on the attitude of it all. Just as per the Plumb's only Yelp review, which I have a defined last night, the Plumb is a, quote, force of art taking over Toronto's commercial property like some kind of creeping vine, crawling over the rubble of long-lost ancient civilization left vacant by a disaster from an historical astrological event. But when there's no money for choice, artists utilize their available spatial opportunities, and space fosters what we make and our ability to share with our community. So thank you for indulging this reflection. I'm feeling very nostalgic lately. I'm an only child, and some of my dearest people in my life have recently passed away, so that learning about Tom Dean's kind in Montreal, I just want to remind myself to embrace the effect that space has had on my own work.
Thank you. Yeah, it's hard to find right now. I think as we shift into the questions, one of the impulses as Ian and I were conceiving of this exhibition and wanting to look back at the early 1970s and to convene these panels also looking back at the early 1970s and oscillating also to today was this desire to do that looking but without nostalgia, if that was possible, to be wanting to hold that energy from the 70s and bring it into the present moment or see what is resonating between the two time periods. And I think there probably is more nostalgia than I had originally wanted to admit. But I guess the question that I will pose to the panel, notings and songs, reaction to not being able to, the whiplash of 1970 to today, but after all of these talks, what does it mean to you in this present moment to create or claim space in today's context? And what are these strategies that artists are using in a way of resisting this sort of institutional ossification? Institution association.
Well, I do. All I can think of to say, from a slightly brain dead state here, is that I think the sense of opening up, which is certainly I was trying to communicate, like, how do you open the space, for people who's, want to get into. I mean, we were starting careers, so you wanted to get in some way, and yet you needed to be, up against in some way. And I think that sort of like, the barbarians or that kind of hitting. I mean, that has continued, and I think that there's kind of forcing is the wrong word, encouraging the institutions to keep making those openings. Now, I don't know whether that is. I don't know where that's explicitly coming from, but I suspect it's coming from this energy that that sort of carries on in what we can only call a kind of tradition. Again, the wrong word.
Take the one. The common, a lot of the common things that we're taking advantage of, plumb, is the notion of alternative, and the notion of independence. That makes. I think that I've been talking to Peggy earlier today of the advantage I think that we have now, and Robert and I, is that it was a real causative time, and I know that with all the economic difficulties that I talked about that we faced, there was a wonderful spin on Trudeau's energy, and that more liberal than openness, and even politics, the scandal of politics, the most animated debates I've heard were Mary Levitt and the church bill on your cross. And I really have to give you credit. I remember Miles Stump's energy in the classroom was very much like the Legion. I hope that he's still like that. But I like you guys are correlated in that role that we have.
I can offer an observation, but I'm definitely not the best person being from a philosophied institution. This than Nicole Sue is an art historian, but I think about the history of arts horticulture as a kind of inheritance, but inheritance with kind of breaks and discontinuities, and an analog for me is thinking about queer histories too. And I think the major kind of break for someone like me in the late 90s was, of course, the kind of historical AIDS crisis, and how that resulted in this kind of like lack of awareness and a rediscovery subsequently of these histories. And so what's interesting for me is that, like, you reflecting on your work with the plumb and versus, and then finding these kind of histories that you may not have known. Maybe you were aware, or I wasn't aware of these histories, where I was kind of a young person, but you kind of like discover that there are forerunners, there are, and that a lot of the strategies and the ways of working are the same. And I think there's something really beautiful in that realization, maybe later on, that you arrived in this similar ethos or like culture or sense of community as other people did across time. So even though the political situation has changed or the funding situation has changed, there's still some impulse. And maybe this is a specifically Canadian kind of inheritance, right? It's a very specific story to Canada, and comes out of that moment in the late 60s and early 70s. But maybe it's not a perfect inheritance where you have full knowledge or capable forfeit that, learning more of this like the cule that it allows you to reflect on that. So there is a great discontinuous kind of legacy there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the sort of, I think Miles and all the first people and myself were all encouraged and eager to learn art history. We were very fascinated with early arts and culture history that was available in a lot of books that we could get access to, and even if it wasn't online, we were eager to learn it. But when we would actually engage with these institutions, then that changed after 40 years, and witnessing, I don't know, difference in what we expected, but also when we get more into it with them, getting access to different little stories, anecdotes, or little treasures that point to some history from 40 years ago was always very inspiring, you know. And I think that this showed the RMG and everyone but Baku, which has been sort of civil layer process there. Yeah, they're just like all of these activities I've never had very much fun at. And that there isn't very much funding available, and yes, the political situations were grim, but I think with the Plum versus UCS galleries and with activities, there was always a drive to sort of carve out what we could, you know, you do as much as we could with as much as we could get. And time and energy was something that we had available to us. And we had a love, oh my God. And yeah. And fun in the face of the shit. Yeah. Otherwise, we just keep going.
Get that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sarah, go. Should say look.
Hi, what we're doing is not too bad. First, thanks to Tom, of course, and thank you to the panel. And it's interesting, you know, doing the trip out in Emery Lake and thinking about what's come to mind is the role of self-determination in arts communities and the role of visibility, like creating spaces, creating collectives, creating something that's outside of whether it be parallel or alternative or contrary to fund official culture. I think there's it needs to be celebrated and gratitude shown. And I'm just wondering if the panel would like to talk about that a little bit. Again, the convene involved also in that your mind in Toronto. There's a rich history in collectives here. And I think that function of having a moxie to go up there creates something that other people can gravitate to, that is a place of self-determination. That's if you address any of your thoughts.
I just wanted to point out that when Versus got to go abroad for different projects in Europe to Stockholm Supermarket or the Platform Project in Athens, one of the most exciting moments of that was meeting all of the artists and the projects that you have in collectives and from throughout Europe and other countries that happened to arrive. And learning about how they survived and how they made things work, you know, because as mentioned, the funding from the governments is a specific Canadian thing. The Europeans don't have that same right. The Americans certainly don't have it the same way. They still create things, right? There's obviously in America there's more private money put into things, but in Europe there isn't. And they find ways to make projects without that. So that was always, that was always very striking to us. And, you know, we were receiving very much money versus got some travel assistance and, our individual studios got a bit of emerging artist grants for something, but this was the extent that one receives Patsy, except an occasional project grant. So this is and this can't stop on from having fun. Oh.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've heard some grossing, I guess, complaining in my travels, like to Montreal, maybe about this kind of, well, the sense that the artist-run centers are kind of established at this point. And so, our group, or this kind of speaks to your, it's a group who's gotten together with a mandate, and our group can't get any funding because it's all locked up. So I don't know why I brought this up, because I don't blame them what to say about it. I mean, I think that most of these centers still are serving a community. They're kind of like, mid-level now way of getting it, of gaining access, of having exposure, etc. So I don't know what to think, like whether that funding, maybe somebody has a comment about it, whether that funding that is so locked up should be reconsidered and redistributed, or should there be a lessening of the support for this network that is now so in place? I don't know. Thoughts? Any thoughts out there? No. Okay.
I think I was speaking somewhat earlier. Was the thinking that and then I don't know this history better than I, but ANPAC, right? It ended up in 1976, and that felt like in the 70s a crucial inflection point for a lot of artist-run sectors too, and the need to kind of bureaucratize and to kind of professionalize it, and that had. So I don't think it's a question of in 70 they were radical, and then 2025 their establishment, but like a gradual kind of process of bureaucratization or professionalization. And this goes back to the comment with MFAs and studio PhDs and all of that too. So I think it's been very incremental, but I also I share this kind of question of when does an institution run its course, and when does it kind of satisfied its mandate, for lack of a better term. I think that the impulse and doing research around Art Metropole in its early years, and to think about now, it's very different from what that original impulse kind of was, and does it still serve? It serves a very different role, I think, in an arts ecology camera that I did in 1970. So. Just to say, is it okay for institutions to expire? Is it okay for artisan culture to, exist for a period and then to kind of pass on to,
Yeah, but I almost want to say that for a reflector,
I almost want to say that bringing that ANPAC, which I also was thinking about, I remember back in the day when ANPAC was getting going, there was, for example, the idea that ANPAC should support the installation of computer technology across the network. And it also had this concept of the living museum, which I think Pekyo took and tried to run with. So it just makes me think maybe if that network and its centers could develop some kind of interesting mandate for today, and that would be a way to revive the spirit of it, rather than just this network of a bunch of. Sorry, I don't mean to demean the centers by saying that. It's a network of not commercial galleries, that give opportunities to awareness. So that it's a thought, but that would be kind of great. I think there's anti to you though.
And what you're thinking is why the Artist Center, but I don't think the driving force is to be institutionalized, to be permanent. I think the idea is experimentation. And if it's a prototype, and I think we all know prototype is not supposed to be sustainable long term. And what if, I understand it's also consumers, but what if the infrastructure for this type of artist run center is not considered but is cemented, but it's to make it influx, constantly influx, and constantly to be reinvented? I mean, that's what it needs. Because I think at the end, I think a lot of the older artist run center, really the struggling point, whether to complain the infrastructure, financials, and administrative bureaucracy, is always struggling with the idea of permanence. So I think perhaps that's not the focus should be, and meaning that they can be liberated. It's easy for me to say.
Yes, one. Very briefly, sorry. But I think that we were talking about the council funding, and I think the council in its grant programs rewards long-running institutions, right? Entirely. So basically, maybe that's just a product of the fact that the longer you grow, the more operating funding you gotta. So there's a financial incentive to like sticking it at, even if you, yeah.
A couple of things. That basically imploded in 1993 over disputes of what exactly constituted an artist-run center. The definition had been thought to be too narrow, and quite frankly, too white. There were centers that wanted to make it be part of, and they didn't have the money to pay artist fees. So right there, though, the point of contention, like, one of the conditions to being an event pack is that you do pay artist fees. And it's like, yeah, but is that worthwhile ambition itself being used negatively to prevent other people from other galleries from becoming members? And this is well after a lot of the collectives that people mentioned in the 1980s had largely, some of them were full flourished, but some of them had been built for previously a few years. They reacted against the fact that the artist-run centers had already become too institutionalized. That there was too long between you apply, you don't find out for over a year, and they have to do their programming a year in advance because of the granting system and all of that. Meanwhile, the artists are doing other work. I'm like, they were in the show Limbo Trap. Got me to new work. And having been involved in artists, that's always a good tense point, because sometimes the new work isn't very good compared to what they decided to program. But in this context, I also think of galleries that we're not seeking in terms of long-term. I think of like Free Parking in the mid-90s, or I think of 8/11. And the last thing they wanted to do was become institutions. And I think, I'm not advocating everyone to do that, but I think that's a healthy attitude also. You have this project, you do the project, and then move on.
Right. Sort of thinking back to Layla, your question on Oscar feature and Irish, like people were talking about here. There's a lot of sweat equity that goes into artist-run spaces in the development of and the establishing these spaces, and I feel, very remiss to assume there should be this endpoint, or rather that predetermine what that should be. Art Metropole is a good example. It functions, it limps along. I think there's not enough resources, but there's not many organizations, or if any, in Canada that really answer what it's doing right now still. And but I'm going to make a claim here. I think I'm the youngest. It's probably the first curator in artist who's younger than the institution I worked for when I was 24 years old when I first started the Western Front. And I say that only because I'm very strongly aware of how much kind of dogma there is about how a certain center should operate and how difficult it is to reinvent a center from the inside with the kind of the weight of history, and sometimes literally the founders looking over your shoulder as you're functioning, as you're doing your job. So I think rather than sort of propose a kind of end game, can we also decide like how a space, I mean, certainly spaces closed, Punk's Gallery, for example, in Vancouver, or one like Cinema or inside for there's many Cold City Gallery here in just, you know, different model here in Toronto. There's lots of pieces where galleries of bullies. But I think not to squander that labor and the progress that's been made in a lot of these organizations to establish really bricks and mortar, sometimes financial resources that can be lasting. Yeah, I guess I'm sort of hopeful that we can kind of, you know, make more room for that, for mutability of these spaces. And I think that looking at their history is very important, and thinking about how that history can reinvigorate the present, I think is a really important call. But I also think that we should resist nostalgia and resist the kind of that framework. I'm going to make one last complaint about Toronto Council, which is, you know, many of us went who are involved in artist consider advocacy or arts advocacy, went to Parliament Hill and black-headed MPs and senators, and as part of the arts coalition efforts to decrease the envelope of the parliamentary appropriation to Canada Council, only to see that money really go into the tech sector, tech consultings by way of Digital Strategies Fund and similar funds. And that was really, you know, Simon Bro's initiative, and we really suffered under through the full Justin Trudeau era what was ultimately Stephen Harper's Canada Council. And I think that we're now at a moment where we can, this is maybe a political moment where we can actually shift, maybe back up and bring back some qualities of earlier models. And I just one lastly about ANPAC. I think about Barbara Shapiro's introduction to the first issue of Parallelogram, where she talks about again the artists from the center nomenclature or parallel gallery nomenclature. We could be correct that ultimately or a net this is a network, and that these can, you know, also I think Suzy mentioned Robert Filliou. I think that Robert Filliou's The Toronto Network is also something that I think had early impact in the arts center scene, and maybe something that we should try to revive or re-edulate that conversation amongst the different facets of these very long-winded apologies, but maybe that's something.
Yeah, thank you. I've been to a lot of talks in the last year. Well, I'm a religious helper, separately, but there's been a trend that usually talk starts focusing around funding and that there's never enough, and it's just always a mega drag. And I'm kind of hoping that like in Ontario, it's not a given. In Canada, it's not given that art is as much part of culture as it is here. We don't have the like hundreds of years of art and culture. And I think we kind of treat it here as a little bit of a given that it should be respected and accepted and funded and whatever. But it doesn't feel like it is that in Ontario. You have a little bit like people want to have their SUV, a house, and a whatever. So I do think there's a world that we can maybe shift a bit in not always being obsessed. Like, and I'm a painter, so I don't know much. I've never gotten funding. Like, I've tried, whatever. But I just think it'd be nice to get out of this shift of always talking about trying to get funding. I think that's why something like the Plumb is incredible, because you all came together, funded yourself for a small fee, and you become one of the more exciting spaces in the whole, you know. And I think there's just not a reputation. Like there's not we're kind of a bubble here, and it's not a huge. The art scene isn't as big as you want. The AGO is, you know, doesn't really represent the rest of the art world, in my opinion. I just do think that there's a world where we need to kind of the focus should shift from funding, and maybe we need to find an exciting way to make art express. Yeah, I don't know. I just think it's like it always ends up to being about funding, and I find it such a shame. And that's maybe naive, but I do think there needs to be a recognition of we're hitting a different kind of art world than the rest of the world. Anyway, it's a small, you know, I don't know, it's just sick.
Yeah, I just got to chime in at this point because I've been experiencing a slow accumulation of intersections between my belief, the duration of life practice, which is more than 40 years now, and how it's intersected several ways with arts or culture. Was my first decade as arts, you know, I had to be kind of curator, as founder of Interaccess. We just celebrated its 40th anniversary 2 years ago, so we're thinking, you know, large picture. And also with A Space and my years as the Electronic Arts Committee, and booking my first space in my East Street, which is more the guerrilla space of 100 gallon. And there was several artists, including Tom, Pierre Poirier, and Suzy, who had shown in that space before I opened first of my more formal gallery spaces, and making the determined choice not to institutionalize curatorial practice or maintain these art-driven studio practice, but to, in a very DIY kind of way, you know, maintain an exhibition space and invite artists to show, and be mindful that I was suddenly in position running parallel, but not intersect with funding agencies who had funded a lot of my first 10 years, and had to self-generate those funds in order to pay the bounty, you know, and have patience to work with institutional timelines dedicated to appositions. And cumulatively, Nell and I experienced the 20+ year timeline of patience that led to the eventual apposition of major work of hers not that long ago. And but having to have the patience to stick it up and see what happens. Was it is like can you know about the flat time back trajectory and first well there's an on of words sacred and Mount Michael.
Okay, this is well, this is a great time for us to
Wrap the conversation. There is food, there is beer, there's wine, there is all of the delightful company of everyone in this room. So please do round if you're